Alright, you finished recording your song. You finished mixing your song and it sounds really, really good. And you finished mastering your song following my easy 3-step mastering process. But it's still sounding a little bit too quiet to you. Well, this video is for you. Welcome back to the Band Guide, where we use GarageBand to create professional sounding music. I'm your band guy, Colin, and before we jump into my 3 tips for a louder master in GarageBand, I want to really highlight that mixing and mastering are 2 completely different stages. When you're mixing, you're taking all the tracks from inside your song, your kick, your drums, your vocals, your synths, your guitars, whatever you have in your mix, and you're mixing them together to sound good, to sound great, to be able to hear everything. And then in mastering, you're taking just the stereo file of that song that you've created, and you're balancing the tone of that song against other songs you might have, other songs on the radio, and you're bringing up the volume up to commercial standards, right? So these are 2 completely different stages. And you can take a great mix and make an amazing master with it, but you cannot take a bad mix and make it sound great with a great master. There's just no way. So if you want to have a great sounding final product, you have to start in the mixing stage. And I want to give you something to help with that. I've put together a 6-step checklist that's completely free. There's a link in the description below, and it just walks through the 6 steps that every professional mix has. So be sure to grab that. It will help you get a more professional sounding mix so that when you go to master it, it's going to sound more professional. Now, the 3 tips I'm going to share with you today, 2 of them are for everyone. The last one is definitely a little bit more advanced, but the first 2 are ones that more or less everyone should be using. And the first one is actually part of that 6-step mixing process. But before we dive into the tips, I want to be clear, this is not going to be a mastering tutorial. If you haven't already seen my 3-step mastering tutorial, check that out first. That's going to help you a lot more. That's the foundational principles of mastering. This is going to be a little bit more advanced or a little bit more specific if you've already been mixing and mastering and you're just finding that your masters aren't quite loud enough. That is when this video is going to help you the most. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive into these tips. Tip number 1, use more compression in the mixing stage. Okay, step 4 in my 6 steps to a pro mix is compression, right? And compression is huge. What compression is essentially doing is it's limiting the dynamic range of the sources, right? So the loudest point is a little less loud, the quietest point is a little less quiet. We're making everything a little bit closer together. Well, we need to be doing that on individual tracks. And if we zoom out and we think about mastering from a macro level, we're looking at your song, we're looking at the little bumps along your song, right? Well, if you have a completely uncompressed song, if you don't have any compression in your mix, then you're going to have really high peaks where the rest of your song is going to be all the way down here, right? So if your highest peak is all the way up here, and then the rest of your song is all the way down here, well, when we're mastering, those peaks are going to start sounding really weird. It's not going to sound very natural. They're really going to impact the limiting that's happening, that's bringing up the volume in your song. They're going to get squashed and sound really weird, right? They're going to make everything just sound a little bit weirder. So if we can squash those peaks down a little bit in the mixing stage, not the mastering stage, but also in the mastering stage, but in the mixing stage before we even get to mastering, so then our peaks are, as opposed to being all the way up here and our song down here, our peaks are just around here and our song's down here, then all of a sudden you can bring that song up a lot higher in volume, make it louder, right? So when it comes to using compression, if you're a little confused about compression, I have a free compression cheat sheet that you can download completely free. I've also done this whole step 4 process on this channel. I'll link that up here as well. So you can really see what compression across an entire mix sounds like. Now, there's no steadfast rules for this. Always has to be compressed. You definitely always have to use compression on this. But there are some near steadfast rules for this. One example is any sort of transient heavy source. So a transient is that initial hit that's huge and then tails off. Think of a kick drum or a snare drum. Those sources often benefit from a little compression. Another example is a vocal. Vocals, if you want them to be really upfront and present in your mix at all times, compression really helps them sit forward in a mix. Another example is bass guitar, right? If you want really full, consistent low end, then having the bass guitar compressed will help them sustain, right? So if you sustain that with compression, if I bring the loudest part down and the quietest part up, then I make it more sustained, and that gives you more consistent full low end in the bass of your mix. So compression, you gotta be doing it in the mixing stage and maybe a little bit more than you're currently doing. So try it out. If you're still confused by compression, be sure to grab that free compression cheat sheet. It's really gonna help you out. Let's go ahead and move on to tip 2. Use saturation. Saturation does two things that is going to naturally help us get a louder master. The first is that saturation actually compresses a little bit. It's a different form of compression. You don't have control over the parameters. It just kind of smooths things in a way that sounds pleasing. So using saturation across your entire master is going to help it be a little bit more compressed, which will give you a little bit more headroom, like we talked about, reduce some of those peaks to bring up our overall volume just a little bit. It also adds harmonic content, which adds fullness. Harmonic content is essentially just pleasing frequencies that kind of fill in the gaps and make things sound a little bit more full and a little bit bigger. And when things sound a little bit bigger, they often sound a little bit louder, right? So if we take a single source, it would look like this. And then if we throw saturation on it, it's going to look like this, right? So it's going to add in frequencies. So you do that across your entire master, you're just going to fill in some of those sonic gaps. So you're getting both a little bit of compression, then also a little bit of sonic fullness, if you will. Now, saturation is great. You can use it in the mixing stage. I definitely recommend doing that on some individual sources if you want to try it out. You can do it on your entire mixing master track if you want to try it out, and then also in the mastering stage. What I find with anything is if you do a little bit at multiple stages, it's going to sound more natural. It's going to sound a little less weird, and it's going to help subtly bring up volume, bring up tone. So think of mixing and mastering as subtle tweaks that just add up. Mastering in particular, really, really subtle tweaks in mastering. You're not trying to transform. You've already made a great sounding mix. You're not trying to transform that. You just want it to sound a little bit fuller and a little bit louder, right? And saturation is going to help you do that. So let's dive into an example of saturation here. This example, we have just a little bit of saturation on the master. This is after channel EQ, after compression. We just have a little bit of saturation going on. Now, it's going to be subtle, but notice as it kicks on, how it just adds fullness, adds a little bit of body. It kind of smooths things a little bit. Again, subtle. Be sure you're listening on good headphones. Check it out. Pretty cool, right? Now, this is a free plugin from Klanghelm. This is the Klanghelm IVGI2. You can download it completely free, and it's just a great saturation plugin that you could use on individual sources, on your master track, on your master. I've done an entire video on using saturation, so check that out to go a little bit further with this. And let's go ahead and move on to tip number 3. Tip number 3, multiband compression. Okay, I said this at the beginning, I want to say it again now because it is super important. This is an advanced tool, an advanced technique, and it is not for everybody. And you don't need it. Multiband compression is not a silver bullet. It is not something that you have, you have to use, or your mix isn't going to sound great. You can make incredible sounding music without multiband compression. So learn the fundamentals of EQ and compression first. That's going to help you out. And when it comes to when should you try out multiband compression, well, when you feel really comfortable with understanding EQ and using EQ, and really comfortable with understanding compression and using compression, that's when you might want to start thinking about exploring multiband compression. It is basically taking the fundamentals of both of those and smashing it together into one plugin. So what does multiband compression allow us to do? Well, let's look at a multiband compressor and I'll explain a little bit more. So here we have the Wave C6. This is a great multiband compressor. Now, it's important to know that GarageBand does not have a built-in multiband compressor. It has the multipressor, which is probably technically a multiband compressor, but it doesn't give you control over any of the variables. So I would not personally use that on a mix because I can't tweak it. I can't make sure it sounds exactly how I want it to. And I'm very timid to ever use something like that on a mix. I like to have control over what I'm doing. So let's take a look at this multiband compressor and the sections here. So first, we basically have an EQ up here, right? If you look at this, we have sub-frequencies up to high-end bright frequencies. And then each frequency range has a band. So these gray lines here, and you see these little arcs here, are individual bands. So for example, I could solo just the mid-range here. And what we're doing is we're able to compress individual ranges, right? So in this case, what I've done is I felt like the kick was kicking a little bit too hard, getting a little too much punch. And then Beyond that, I then want a little bit more consistency out of it. So what I've done is I've actually compressed it with a range of up to 2 decibels, 1.9 decibels, and then brought it back up a little bit so it's just a little bit more consistent. So the actual peaks will get turned down, but then the overall bass is going to actually be about the same. So check it out if we listen in solo here. If I exaggerate that, if I make this range really extreme. So you can do some really cool stuff. I've also then gone into this upper range here, if we listen to that. And I've taken that and I actually have it kind of expand a little bit every time there's a hit on there. Mastering, we want to do these things really, really subtly, right? So maybe up to 2 decibels. So a multiband compressor can definitely add to your mix. It can definitely add some character into your final master. And ultimately what it can do is help you tame some dynamics that, again, allows for a little more headroom to get that master just a little bit louder. And that is the name of the game in mastering. How can we tame dynamics to get a little bit more volume? And sometimes it's not as simple as, well, I'm just going to compress the whole master, because maybe in this case that kick was just pushing the compressor a little bit too much. So as opposed to compressing the entire signal every time that kick came on, I'm able to just compress that low end of the mix. Kind of neat, right? But again, very, very complex, very advanced, and this could end up ruining a otherwise excellent mix. So be very, very timid with multiband compression, but if you feel like you really understand EQ and compression, try it out, dive into it, start exploring it a little bit. And there we have it, 3 tips for a louder master in GarageBand. Now, it's important to note that the first 2 tips really start in the mixing stage. And that's because while mixing and mastering are 2 distinctly different stages, there's only so much you can do in the mastering stage if we haven't done these things in the mixing stage. So it has to start in the mixing stage. You can only make a master sound as good as the mix, right? So the mix has to sound great if you want a great sounding master. And if you get it a little bit more dynamically controlled in the mixing stage, you can create a louder master in the mastering stage. Keep that in mind. And if you're looking for help on the mixing stage, be sure to grab that 6-step checklist to a pro mix. I'll link to it again in the description below. It's completely free and it will really help you get a more professional sounding mix in GarageBand. Before we go, I want to hear from you. Do you have any tips to help us get a louder master? Let us know in the comments below. If this video was helpful, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you next week with another video. One thing